Thank you very much for joining us today at the second event of UNODC's first ever Knowledge Week on trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants. Gender matters. Yesterday, one of the panelists said something that stuck with me. We sometimes think that we are alone in facing challenges in addressing trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants. However, we hope that this Knowledge Week and the vast expertise and experience collected in UNODC publications and shared by experts during these events will show you how much we can learn from each other and that we are not alone in addressing these complex issues, like we discussed today. At today's Knowledge Week event, experts and practitioners will explore the interlinkages between addressing trafficking in persons, gender-based and sexual violence, and how to respond to these crimes in a gender-responsive, victim-centered and trauma-informed way. My name is Pascal Reinke-Schreiber, and I am a crime prevention and criminal justice officer at the Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling section of UNODC, and I will be moderating this event. Before I start this very interesting and timely expert panel discussion, allow me to briefly touch on a few general points for this meeting. This meeting is being recorded. Please submit questions to the panelists via the chat function. And thank you already to those who have submitted questions with their registration. We will try our best to reply to some of these during the discussions. If we have time in the end of the discussion, it will be our honor to reply to additional questions from the meeting chat. We will share links to all mentioned publications and tools in the chat as well. You can also find all of these relevant publications on the Knowledge Week website. In the end of the event, we would kindly ask your feedback on our publications and resources as well as Knowledge Week itself. And thank you very much for your support already with this. Today, we talk about gender matters and why gender matters, and especially why gender equality matters and the protection from gender-based violence. In particular, trafficking in persons for sexual exploitation can be seen as a specific form of gender-based violence. Furthermore, trafficking disproportionately still affects women and girls. Another major concern is the victimization of smuggled migrant women and girls, becoming victims of sexual violence and exploitation in situations of smuggling. At UNODC, we are committed to gender equality and women's empowerment, a victim-centered, gender and age-responsive, as well as trauma-informed approach in order to better identify, protect, and support victims of trafficking and aggravated smuggling, and bring traffickers and smugglers to justice. Therefore, we have developed a toolkit dedicated to human rights-based and gender-responsive approaches to human trafficking and migrant smuggling, providing guidance to these questions as well. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome 3 gender champions and experts in the field to this expert panel on gender matters. We have 3 excellent speakers with us who will share their experience and expertise in applying a gender lens in their work. Why this is important, what challenges they face, and what benefits a gender-responsive approach will bring to addressing trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants, and to the protection and support of victims of trafficking and aggravated smuggling. Our first speaker is Laurie Munn, who has a JD from Columbia Law School and a BA from the University of California at Berkeley. She has worked for over 20 years in the fields of international human rights and rule of law, with a strong focus on women's rights and gender equality, including violence against women and human trafficking. She founded an international women's rights NGO dedicated to strategic litigation, Women's Link Worldwide, and has since worked as a staff member consultant for diverse UN agencies, including UNODC, the Council of Europe and the OSCE in diverse countries around the world. For instance, she was the lead international consultant of the UNODC case law analysis study on female victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation as defendants. Next expert on our panel is Maria Biala Alonso. She is a senior police officer of the Spanish National Police. Nowadays, she is a country officer representing UNODC in Costa Rica and advising on migrant smuggling, gender and human rights for an international project. In the spirit of today's event, she supports initiating, mentoring, planning and implementing operational procedures sensitive to crime, gender and intersectionalities. Maria joined the police when she was 20 years old and lived 3 years in Canada. During her careers in law enforcement, she was deployed as team leader and seconded national expert as air, sea, and land borders, and has received the White Merit Badge in counterterrorism. She has extensive experience in cooperating with international agencies and missions in countering smuggling of migrants and trafficking crimes. Maria emphasizes that she has a strong sense of community and social justice and thrives in organizations with a strong work ethic where everybody can feel safe to develop their own personality, talents, and innovate. So we hope that this is the right place for you also at Knowledge Week as one of our experts, because we also want to develop knowledge and innovation. With Marcelo Colombo, we are joined by another gender champion and great UNODC partner today. Marcelo is a lawyer with a specialization in criminal law and has over the past 13 years worked in the field of human trafficking and in the interpretation and the application of human rights laws to hundreds of cases regarding exploitation, trafficking in persons, and violation of rights of women and children. Since 2008, he has been federal prosecutor and coordinator of the National Special Unit devoted to preventing, identifying, and prosecuting trafficking organizations and protecting the victims. As part of his commitment to address human trafficking and strengthen victim protection, Marcelo emphasizes to put into practice non-criminalization, non-revictimization, and non-refoulement principles. From 2014, he has also been the coordinator of the first Ibero-American trafficking and smuggling network of prosecutors called RETRAM, with the mission to guarantee timely access to shared information and guidelines among 21 countries. In addition to all of this, he has taught as a professor of criminal law and trafficking in various universities at graduate and postgraduate levels for 20 years. It is such a pleasure to have all three of you with us today for this very important, exciting event. Our first speaker is Laurie Mann, as I said, and the question that Laurie will explore for us is why it is so important to provide gender analysis and to look at trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants also from a gender perspective. Laurie, thank you much. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to participate in this event. So in preparing some observations to share with you and going over them a couple of times, I realized they're very long. And so what I'm going to do is make the key points and try to elaborate as much as I can, and then I can add more as the conversation goes on. But I wanted to start out by just saying that many of the observations that I'm going to share were developed during while conducting the research and working on this UNODC report, Female Victims of Trafficking for Sexual Exploitation as Defendants, which analyzed 53 judicial decisions from 16 jurisdictions from around the world, primarily in Latin America, Europe, and the United States, but also in Southern Africa and in Asia and the Pacific. So it was a broad study, and so that's what I'm going to be drawing on when I'm telling you speaking about certain issues. And if you're interested in them, you can go look at I think there's a link on the site, so you can look at the publication. I wanted to also just say that I think when we're talking about gender generally, I would really highlight that we're talking about gender and it's all of its intersectional manifestations, so that render women particularly vulnerable. And here I'm talking about age, like minor victims, migrants, and ethnic minorities who might, because of their migrant status or language differences, be isolated, people living in poverty. In the study, it was very interesting to note a significant portion of the cases involved victims of trafficking and victims as defendants who were single mothers and providing the sole support for their children or taking care of elderly family members. And so that, given the level of poverty and the economic burden that they shared, that had a big contribution to their being exploited. I also want to highlight the issue of women with, people in general, but women with disabilities, with mental and developmental disabilities, because there's also important, I would say several of the cases involved victims who had developmental disabilities, also victims of prior and contemporaneous forms of gender-based violence, who are also victims of trafficking and suffered trauma. And with these two, not only does the disability and the traumatization of the prior victimization affect make them susceptible to trafficking, but it also really impacts their ability to engage with the criminal justice system effectively. And it came out in several cases, and I'll highlight that, but if we have time. So again, I want to, in addition to women being overrepresented as victims, it also was important to note, and what prompted this study was the fact that they're also overrepresented among the prosecuted and convicted traffickers comparatively to, or not say overrepresented, there's a large proportion when you compare them to the prosecution of women for other transnational organized crimes. And I think this has been coming out in consecutive glow tip reports that UNODC publishes. And I think for trafficking, the number was 30% of women, and for other transnational organized crimes, women represented 15% of those who were prosecuted. So it's really a significant difference, and that's what prompted this study. And as I'll get into a little bit later, it's the gendered roles that women play as victim defendants or as in their engagement in the trafficking enterprise that renders them more vulnerable to prosecution, and thus this overrepresentation. Okay, so I have 3 key points to make. So if I don't cover it, I will tell them now. One is that it's really important to understand that all forms of gender-based violence, including human trafficking, operate on a continuum of violence against women, and that they interact and contribute to each other in very different ways. And they also, the dynamics involved in each of them, the coercive dynamics that are underlying all of them are very similar. And so it's keeping those in mind that I'd like to do today, and also pointing out numerous parallels between gender-based violence and particularly intimate partner and domestic violence and trafficking, to show where I think those who are working on anti-trafficking could learn something from those who have been working on this issue more concretely as a form of domestic violence in a different sector, because they're sort of divided. The second thing is the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. This is a perfect example of what I was just talking about, where the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator is examined very specifically in the data collection and engagement of victims of domestic and intimate partner violence. However, it's not being looked at so systematically in the anti-trafficking movement. And when you're talking about gender and the gendered elements of the crime, the victim's relationship with the perpetrator is essential, I think, and I'll get into why. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the dynamics of what's referred to as coercive control. This was also, I think, one of the more important findings of the study. And the way that coercive control operates in intimate partner violence and in trafficking is very similar. And it is very important then to look at the national legislation and the ways in which coercion is defined, and whether it's defined in terms of use of force, or whether it's more in line with like an abusive position of vulnerability, for example. So where there's this emphasis on force, like physical force and violence, the legislation misses the dynamics involved in several forms of trafficking. And this was really a big lesson that has been learned in the gender-based violence field, which is, or domestic violence field, I should say, which is, we've been pushing for years to have broader forms of violence recognized than physical violence. So in some countries, still, you have to show your physical injuries to prosecute domestic violence, but now we understand that there's psychological violence, economic violence, all of these other forms of violence, and those need to be taken into consideration. And I would argue that in those broader concept of coercive control that doesn't focus on physical force should also be addressed in the issue of human trafficking. Okay, I'm going to just mention a couple of gendered norms and gendered elements, and then I can get, well, actually, maybe I'll just go straight into the, yeah, let me mention these. Okay. One is, I think it's important to note that gendered norms often mask human trafficking. So what we think of as normal then masks our ability to identify trafficking, the crime. So in one example would be the way early marriage might be common within some Romani communities, Asian communities, etc. So therefore, it's seen as like a cultural practice, and here we are also talking about intersectionality. It's seen as a cultural practice, and law enforcement doesn't see the need to intervene because, oh, it's that, you know, the Romani community, they get married with the young girls. I was on a panel not long ago or participating in a conference, and somebody mentioned that the police actually went to the wedding. You know, it's normalized and therefore not seen. So the trafficking, if there is trafficking or exploitation involved, which there sometimes is, it's missed. And the same way that because of their prior experience of being sexual with gender-based violence, a lot of times victims don't recognize themselves as victims because this is what they've lived in their childhood. The violence becomes normalized. Another way in which gender roles function, it was addressed very clearly in this UNODC study, which is that the trafficker, when the victim defendants, their engagement in the acts of trafficking were very gendered roles. They assumed they recruited other victims. So, for example, a trafficker would send the victim who happens to have a relationship with as a girlfriend, maybe to her hometown or to the country where she was from, to recruit other vulnerable women or girls in the same community that she came from. And so, there was an explicit use of the victim to recruit. Whether the victim wanted to go or not and become a defendant again or not, that's another question. But victims also, these victim defendants, their roles also involved collecting the proceeds of the other victims of trafficking because they were also on the ground engaged in this being exploited by the trafficker at the same time in prostitution. And so they were collecting the proceeds. They also trained new victims in how to engage in prostitution or, getting them ready in the evening. They were very low-ranking roles, very proximate to the exploitation, and they were very exposed. And this came out in several cases, in that the traffickers used this as an explicit strategy to protect themselves from being to shield themselves from prosecution. And so it's a very strategic choice. I'm going to talk about the relationship to the trafficker. So this, as I mentioned, is critical in the domestic violence context, and one of the reasons why is it's because in GBV circles, it's known that women face the greatest risk of violence from those who are closest to them or who are known to them. And so when you look in the relationship, the two key relationships I would highlight are the abusive romance, so that traffickers use romance as a way to engage the victim into being exploited in the first place, and also they use that as a way to get them to engage in acts of trafficking. It's called like the lover boy syndrome. And then the other one being family members, so where traffickers were trafficking female members of their family, or trafficking rings run by families. And again, this one of the interesting things about these, I mean, as I mentioned, trafficking can also be, in this continuum, a form of domestic violence. So it's not just domestic violence leads to trafficking, but it can be a form of domestic violence. And this domestic violence and interpersonal violence argument was used by defense in a couple of cases to evade criminal responsibility for trafficking. So in other words, they said, oh, I didn't beat her to get her to engage, to exploit her sexually. I was beating her up because she was my girlfriend. I was beating her up because she was my wife. It was just domestic violence. I thought that's a very clever strategy that, again, relies on our understanding of gender-based violence and domestic violence. They're manipulating those concepts to try to benefit from them, and I think that's very telling. Yeah, should I stop there?
No, it is so great to listen to you because you touched on so many important points. I made so many notes, and we could have, of course, filled the hour with these points because they are so essential. And I think first of all, what you mentioned about intersectionality. So we cannot just look at one factor. We have to look at other factors that are equally important in assessing these cases. But also everything you talked about, victims not recognizing themselves as victims, the support they need to overcome this normalized violence, to not stop trafficking investigations because it seems a personal or private matter. All of these things, and I think all of these points are also an excellent introduction to our next speaker, because Maria comes from a law enforcement perspective as well, and she will tell us and thank you so much, Laurie, for these points. And you already touched also on some points that will come up later from questions from the audience about some of these harmful practices as well. And yeah, you mentioned that sometimes, of course, the victims don't trust law enforcement, and they don't trust them because maybe, for example, what you said about the relationships of family involvement in trafficking, they have trust a person, and then they were exploited. And I'm very happy to now give the floor to our second speaker, Maria, who will talk about how we can work in a gender-responsive way to address trafficking and smuggling in law enforcement, what needs to be considered, and what advantages we gain when we work with the gender lens on these topics and crimes. Thank you very much, Laurie. And Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pascale, and thank you for introducing me and inviting me to this event. I'm excited today to be both a contributor and a participant, because I am definitely learning a lot from my colleagues and networking with all of you. As Pascale said, I have extensive operational experience in gender and migration in a time where I didn't even know these matters that were on the table. They were actually gender matters. For instance, I still remember how frustrating can be for a national law enforcement agent seeing smugglers abusing of women in their transit route and not having the knowledge or the international law that was supportive for initiating investigations in that area of crime. I remember the eyes of one African woman that told me, Maria, many men dressed on uniform, military uniform, raped me in a hole in the forest, but any of them could touch my soul. Well, definitely my soul was touched by all these testimonies, and my bosses know I faithfully reported them. And today I'm here with you to speak up about abused and neglected migrants, victims of aggravated migrant smuggling offenses. According to the UN Migrant Smuggling Protocol, which your country has probably signed, Article 6.1 defines the basic offense, which is creating, possessing, providing travel or ID documents to facilitate an irregular entry or enabling an irregular stay. Surely all practitioners, academical or member states that are attending this meeting relate to this baseline in their penal codes or migration codes. In addition, the mandatory aggravations under Article 6.3 of our protocol are endangering the migrant's life or safety, or inhuman and degrading treatments and exploitation. There is also, and you know that, a list of optional aggravations under the UNODC model law against smuggling of migrants, based on the figure either of the migrant, the offender, the crime, of the means the smuggler used. Law enforcement, we need to pay attention to these aggravations to prosecute the crime, whilst being ambassadors of human rights of the most vulnerable, and intersectionalities such as being a child or an elder, pregnant women, disabled person, migrants' vulnerability was abused. It definitely plays a role in the profile the smuggler target and the modus operandi he or she used to capture the attention of the victim. We are obliged to investigate aggravated smuggling crimes, and this obligation is both a moral and a legal requirement to follow the rule of law and investigate these crimes and the criminals committing them. International organizations have a mandate of supporting and investigating transnational crime. This mandate shouldn't be gender neutral because it reproduces inequality. On the opposite, this is the approach, gender targeted. We are enhancing with law enforcement in the project Star Some in Latin America that starts recently by UNODC in Latin American countries and Caribbean. We have all the international structures we need to end impunity of sexual-based violence crimes that affect women, men, girls, and boys, whether they are migrants in transit or destination countries. And within this project, Star Some in Latin America, we know that aggravating circumstances require sometimes interpretations or correspond to other offenses, for instance, murder, kidnapping, assault, rape, torture, or trafficking. The UNODC model law allows for these aggravating circumstances to be transformed into national laws, either as aggravated circumstances or standalone offenses. Obviously, gender-based violence is central to trafficking of women that are being forced into sexual slavery. International structures and debates on the value of consent and end demand that exist nowadays to combat trafficking human beings can be also applicable as well to smuggling of migrants when sexual-based violence crimes are committed in transit and destination countries. THV protocols should not exclude other victims of gender and sexual-based violence crimes because they just don't fall under a type of crime. Instead, these protocols could at least inspire best practices of these shadowed crimes and enhance the protection of victims of sexual-based violence crimes. Perpetrators of acts that endangered the life or safety of migrants or constituted inhuman or degraded treatment could therefore be prosecuted under charges. But why don't they work? Why don't we start, for instance, reviewing the identification process of these victims at first or second borderline? What are we lacking in terms of cooperation and coordination of aggravated migrant smuggling crimes? Maybe lack of knowledge or technical means, or lack of knowledge on the importance of information gathering, especially gender disaggregated data. We cannot respond to what we don't know about. We cannot know about something unless you measure it. We cannot measure it if you don't look for it. We don't look for it if we don't know what to look for. We don't know what to look for unless people in your policing organizations have experience or interest in gender-based violence crimes. I stood at the border And I have been under pressure to keep the line moving, to keep the line up moving, or to debrief a migrant per day to gather intelligence on modus operandi and routes. We understand limited resources in policing may affect and impact the results. The question is, what can you do as an individual in an imperfect world? You can become aware that migration is gendered, and unfortunately, how women suffer the worst in migration process because they are sexualized. And at the same time, try to impact the gender-neutral procedures to include the identification and prosecution of gender-based violence crimes. For instance, all police in the world, we are connected with databases, either national, regional, or also international. However, these databases are normally targeting the perpetrators, trying to stop the free movement of criminals when borders are porous. What if, as an international, national, or regional police law enforcement with a calling for gender and human rights, we develop a system where the technological means of policing are victim-centric approach to crime? And databases could be used also to protect victims and grant human rights. Remember, you cannot have a crime without a victim. Databases should be used to either protect and support migrant victims or prosecute perpetrators of crime. But we sometimes lack either the knowledge or the technical means that allowed us to report crime transnationally and to integrate gender analysis, and my colleague was saying before, in our investigations and inform our standardized procedures or police databases sensitive to gender matters. Maybe we lack sensitive laws to gender mainstreaming and human rights approach to crime. However, there are actions that we can take to inform our standardized operational procedures, our operations, and judicial reports with a gender-sensitive approach to crime. Our UNODC manual, that we feel very proud of it, it's Abuse and Neglected, a Gender Perspective on Aggravated Migrant Smuggling Offenses and Response. It considers important to emphasize that states' responses to migrant smuggling lack of gender perspectives, either in the legislation or their implementation frameworks. It means hands-on work. That is the process of assessing the implications for women and men of any planned action, including legislation, policies, and programs. However, according to the Abused and Neglected Manual, along the migration pathway, researchers have established how the frequency and kinds of violence sustained by men and women are often gender-based. In the Central American corridor, for instance, that is my area of deployment with the project Starsom, migrant women are more likely to be targeted for sexual abuse and assault, while men are more often experience other types of violence, also including sexual violence for humiliation and emasculation, as well as homophobic and transphobic violence. While documented by academics, there are no official resources documenting gender-based violence in the context of migrant smuggling within Central America that I am aware. When I was working as law enforcement and seconded national expert in Italy with Europol and Frontex, I learned a quote. It says, "Cominciate a fare ciò che è necessario, poi ciò che è possibile, e all'improvviso vi sorprenderete a fare l'impossibile," which means start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible, and suddenly you are doing the impossible. Thanks so much for your attention. The floor is yours, dear Pascale.
Maria, thank you so much. What an inspirational statement this was. Thank you so much. I think you captured very well where we are at and what we can achieve when we don't ignore what we don't know, but we do what we know. And I just want to pick up a few things that you said. So I really liked what you said, that we have to be ambassadors for those most vulnerable, that we have moral as well as legal obligations to do that. And that also, if we continue to be gender blind, that this only recreates gender inequality. So thank you very much for giving us this your perspective and sharing your expertise and experience in this field with us. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to Marcelo, who will talk about some of the gender considerations that might be overlooked sometimes in cases of trafficking and smuggling. For instance, how victims are affected by sexual and intimate partner violence, as mentioned earlier by Laurie, but also how this affects successful prosecutions of trafficking in persons and aggravated smuggling. Thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pascale. I want to thank UNODC for the invitation. It's an honor to share such a distinguished panel and trying to contribute to this relevant issue. Thus, I will split my presentation into 3 parts. I will touch some specific considerations about the role of women as perpetrators in smuggling and trafficking cases, and some forms of specific victimizations of women as well. In particular, when it comes to trafficking persons, I will touch the interlinkages between the status of victim and perpetrators. Second, I will make a quick reference regarding the relationship between corruption of public officials and trafficking, which is seen very often in our investigation, and how and why can this relationship affect disproportionately women as well. And third, and finally, I'm going to mention some, I think, good practices I believe useful to improve investigations or litigations, and of course, wider our knowledge. First thing that I think has to be said is that we need more information and field investigation regarding smuggling of persons and role of women within that scenario. Perhaps one of the exceptions to that is a case law analysis done by the UNODC in 2019 called Women in Migrant Smuggling. And because many of its findings match with the features of our cases or the cases we have seen in our jurisdictions, I would like to share 3 important conclusions that you can get from it, and I totally share. The first one is that the action that could have the greatest impact at reducing the effect of the criminalization of migrant smuggling on women would be to exclude conduct aimed at facilitating the movement of close family members when this facilitation is not done to obtain a financial or other material profit, and to exclude as well their own movement from the scope of migrant smuggling officers. Many cases, including in this case law study and many cases that we have seen, were of this kind of women that were facilitating the entrance to other countries of family members. Second, roles of women also appear to be gendered in this matter. In our cases, there is we didn't find evidence of women's participation in violent acts, for instance, in the context of migrant smuggling. And those motivations of women participating in migrant smuggling related acts are varied and complex. They are often connected or with familial needs and with children needs. Finally, their backgrounds tend to be quite similar. Most of the women in this kind of cases are working class, low-income residents of marginalized communities with limited paths to social or economic mobility. So what we found is that they were acting in an attempt to assist friends or family members or reach a safe country and to improve their own quality of life. Having said that, I insist in the need of concreting more comprehensive study about the smuggling phenomenon, and particularly the role of women as possible victims in this kind of structure and criminal organizations. Moving now to the role of women in trafficking cases, I will support and follow my intervention with another law case study that was mentioned by Laurie extensively. So I will go quickly here, done by the UNODC, which is called Female Victims of Trafficking for Sexual Exploitation as Defendants. First, that study also matches with the features of cases in our region because it shows perfectly that women have also gender role, as has been said by Laurie, in traffic for sexual exploitation processes. And generally, this role can be found in the recruiting process of other victims, but most of the time for the economic benefit of other persons, or in the stage of harboring and exploitation, controlling or managing the brothel they don't own, controlling time for sexual intercourses of other victims, collecting money always for the benefit of others, and other similar tasks. Due to that, as was already mentioned, it's extremely important to consider, I think, two things in this kind of investigation and this kind of litigation. First, take seriously into account the life story of each woman who appears as perpetrator. And second, the real nature of that relationship between the woman and her sexual exploiter. In cases where the woman has been exploited in the past, the possible existence of trauma must be considered, at least as an alleviated circumstances. And it's also important to consider with special attention when the participation of women in the process of trafficking coexists or lives together with her own exploitation, because that must constitute an important warning flag for possible application of the non-punishment principle. I will move quickly to some trends, or there's another trend that appears in several trafficking cases in our region and has to do with the victimization of women. And it usually happens in labor exploitation within sweatshops or agriculture premises that women subject to servitude or another conditions are also sexually abused by their exploiters, somehow as part of a continuum of violence exerted against her, a sort of plus of extra abuse that has a straight connection with her condition of woman. Another trend that we have seen in forced labor investigation is that some kind of exploitation of women is usually like overlooked by authorities when the man, usually her husband, has been subject to labor exploitation. An example of that could be when women arrive at the premises of exploitation with her husband who is going to be exploited there, and she has to do the clean and the cook for all the other victims without receiving any payment. This kind of situation sometimes is not considered as an act of exploitation in the course of the investigation, which only concentrates on focusing the male exploitation, making invisible female labor exploitation as well. Then the relationship between corruption and trafficking cases conducts me to another trend of victimization that is connected with the sextortion. Sextortion is a type of corruption which occurs when those in authority extort sexual favors in exchange for exercising or not exercising their authority. And this type of corruptive act appears often in trafficking investigation for sexual exploitation, when policemen or labor inspector ask the owner of a manager of a brothel to give him sexual service of the woman for free as part of the legal arrangement for not being denounced. In other words, to receive protection, a sort of bribe paid by the woman body or the woman service. On the other hand, that kind of practice is often naturalized by the woman under sexual exploitation, who rarely consider it as part of the continuum of the situation she's enduring. Due to that, it's important to take into account in the course of an investigation the presence of policemen in the premises of exploitation and inquire the reasons for that presence, because it could be connected with this idea of providing protection to this brothel. Finally, it's obvious that this kind of practice has a negative impact in granting access to justice because it deters women to denounce, and it works as a warning message to her about the power and influence of the trafficking among powerful people. For that reason, it increases their vulnerability and the idea of no exit for her situation. A good practice to deal with this situation is carry out joint investigation with anti-corruption officers or prosecutors in order to achieve better outcomes and a better investigation and litigation in this kind of cases. Finally, some good practice that I can mention here and I can put on the table is, I'm going to mention 3 of them. First, the identification and detections of women victims by a professional staff. The first approach done by social workers, psychologists, especially women, makes the difference in this kind of intervention. It is important to gain the victim trust and to build a a relationship of confidence, not only for the success of the case, but even more important for the recovery of the victims as well. Then the use of expert witnesses at trial in the litigation process of a case has shown very good results or outcomes. Most of the judges are not aware of the consequence that a trafficking victimization may produce on victims of trafficking or similar kind of gender violence. Therefore, they can distrust of their testimony when they take back their accusation or simply deny the evident situation of sexual exploitation. Dissociation and state of denial can sometimes be explained better by a professional intervention. And third, we have to pay attention to be very strict in respect the non-re-victimization principle, while hearing the victim properly once, not receiving direct question from the defendant, tapping her testimony in the investigation phase, preserving as much as possible her intimacy, not permitting improper questions, for example, about the past sexual experiences or questioning her way of life, and assessing her case without any prejudice, stereotypes. And finally, granting economic restitution and compensation for her, I think is key. So to grant and to finally get a complete restitution and compensation for her. And the last thing I would like to mention is the special consideration that needs cases of transsexual or LHTB community as victims. They are often overlooked as potential victims of trafficking. Their sexual exploitation is often harder than the woman. The access to justice and to claim for protection is more difficult as well for them. And there is an historical distrust in criminal agencies, totally understandable due to all kinds of abuses and discriminations. But we need to build a bridge there. We need to pay attention and need to focus on this collective of people, make field investigation and studies about their needs, their experience, and how we can grant their access to justice as well. So that's what the short things that I would like to share with you, and I'm open to all the questions you will have. Thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Marcelo, for all this information and explaining what some of these challenges are, but also indicating already how you are overcoming some of them in your work. I think you also made the connection back to Laurie in the beginning about this continuum of violence, and what you said was the idea of no exit. And I think this also relates back to what Laurie said in the beginning. It's not just the physical violence, this stereotypical picture that we have of chains or a gun to the head that we have to look at, but also other forms of control, coercion, and violence. And also, thank you very much for touching on the recovery of victims and how important this is in addressing these forms of aggravated smuggling, sexual violence, and also exploitation and trafficking in persons successfully. We are already coming towards the end of our event slowly. We have received some questions from participants, and allow me to take one already, because we have received quite a few questions on the COVID-19 pandemic through the registrations. And thank you for those questions. And I would like to point you to our global assessment study that we undertook this year, where we assessed the impact of COVID-19 and gender-based violence, that the Justice section has done that, and also on trafficking in persons, which we published in July. And the pandemic has, of course, not put a hold on trafficking. Traffickers have adapted. They have moved recruitment and exploitation to more local and private settings, as well as online. And support needs for survivors and factors of vulnerability have at the same time increased due to the pandemic. And the assessment study includes some forward-looking recommendations and also promising practices of practitioners, how they responded to trafficking in persons during the pandemic. Another question I saw in the chat just now was about the concept on gender more broadly, and including of course, other gender dimensions such as LGBTQI, A+. And I think Maria and Marcelo, you already touched on this. I would also like to mention that one of the issues, of course, is to have the cases and the availability of data about these considerations. But for example, in the abused and neglected study, we also looked at some of these factors in a very initial fashion, of course, but one of the things that also has to be mentioned when we talk about, for example, reporting of victimization, if certain persons are criminalized because of their sexual orientation, for example, this is of course very worrying when they cannot report and cannot seek help or access justice. And I will pose another two questions to our panelists in closing this event. And please feel free, Marcelo, Laurie, and Maria, to turn on your cameras and reply to these questions to your best. Like, you can pick and choose what you want to reply to in more detail. We still have 10 minutes. So one of the questions was about these other gender dimensions going beyond sex. Then another question is related to harmful practices, to what extent some of these harmful cultural traditional practices contribute to victimization and trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants. And Laurie already mentioned in the beginning of her talk that, of course, these should never serve to cover up trafficking, for example, or also aggravated smuggling. So it shouldn't stop investigations. It shouldn't deter from our obligation to investigate and protect victims of these crimes. Then another question, and this is really a closing question for all three of you, is the working groups on trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants will convene next week. And based on your expertise and from a gender perspective, and in conclusion of this event, what are some of the most urgent issues that you think should be considered when discussing the topics next week? So please, maybe we start with Laurie again, then Maria, then Marcelo, to answer these questions that were posed to us. Thank you. Laurie, you are still mute and I cannot see your video. Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I mean, I think that my biggest, I'm going to go to the last one just in the question of, just in the interest of time, because I think that the other ones were sort of touched on already. As I mentioned, I think that one of the most important issues around trafficking in persons is this issue regarding the requirement of the use of physical force. And I think, and the way that that's read into different national jurisdictions, and the sort of what's considered more like trafficking light, I'm just going to, which is this abusive position of vulnerability, which really comes in. I think looking more deeply at the application of what coercion really means. I think that's in the examples that Marcelo gave. I think those were excellent, and also, yeah. I also just want to say more broadly, I think some of a couple of, we're not like, I think a lot of the cases that I've looked at have been really sort of, as Marcelo described, like very working class people, very like, you know, very vulnerable categories of persons. And I'm not saying that the victims were not as such, but I think like last week's prosecution of R. Kelly in the music industry in the United States, you know, it took like decades to get this guy to be convicted, and he was, you know, basically trafficking in plain sight for all of this time. I mean, I think when we're talking about the systems at play, the economic and social systems, it's not just at that lower level, it's the broader social economic model that we have, and who we see as dispensable and not dispensable. That I would like to close with that concept of, you know, who gets the, you know, this maintaining of the privilege of a few to access to, you know, to power and sex and exploitation is, I think, a broader social issue that we should be also looking at. But that might not be for the working group. But I think generally we should cast our net wider and continue to cast our net wide. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Maria, would you like to answer to some of these questions, or one? You're mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Pascale, and thank you, Lori, for going through the third question. I think I was feeling more likely to respond also the third one, but I will also comment maybe also how important it's to identify and to protect victims when it's a matter of LGBTIQ. I also commented on these transphobic crimes that we also need to include specific means and security protocols for these issues. If you have a working group, and in this working group, it's law enforcement, prosecutors, and it's oriented to really creating and generating impact, I would suggest three things. First of it, we need to do a gender analysis of crime with the 5 profiles. That means that will inform our protocols, that will inform our outcomes. Second one, we need to use gender markers if you are actually developing a protocol or also guiding investigations. What is the gender marker you are applying in your investigations? Because that will make you accountable, and that will also make the status quo of your law enforcement accountable during the years. So that means if that year we apply gender marker 1, and eventually we might be reproducing some sort of inequalities, and next year we are applying gender marker 3, that means we've improved. And so that means there is a change in our law enforcement. So that's the second suggestion that I would provide for this table discussion, or what you meant that you are going to have. So the third thing, it's also looking at the development goals. That's important, because that should inspire our actions also for law enforcement. So I would say that. I would say let's take 3 actions, very focused, very impactful, and move on from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Also for emphasizing the sustainable development goals in our work again. Marcelo, please, and then I will close the meeting.
Yes, just a very quick considerations about the hormone practices. What I think it's need to be improved is the way we listen to victims, the way we follow their account, and we need to make that in the most friendlier environment that we can find, and trying to protecting her of I have intrusive defenders or aggressive defenders. I think we usually see in our investigations that defenders try to blame the victims about the conditions, about their style of life, about the way of living, and so that is it's a harmful practice within the judiciary that allows that to emerge, no, to the lawyers to do that. Of course, the lawyers are totally entitled to make the cross-examination of the witness. I'm not talking about that, but they can do that cross-examination with full respect about the victims, the conditions, and the things she had come through. That's one of the things that emerged, I think, clearly in our investigations. And the other one is how the judges assess the testimony of a victim and they usually falls into some stereotypes about the ideal victim, what are the ideal victim could have done in that situation or might have done in that situation, and they cannot put on the shoes of that victim because they are becoming from another social structure, another social class. So that is I think a very harmful practice, but it's also very difficult to correct. No, it's very difficult to train judges, to train prosecutors in order to be aware of this bad practice. That was one of the or two of the bad practice that I would like to share with you. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. Thank you very much for attending today's panel discussion and joining us. We are already at the end of it. I really hope we could show you our commitment to these topics and that we are here to learn and to exchange and to develop further. I want to warmly thank our expert panelists for sharing their insights with us. It was excellent and so inspiring. Furthermore, I would like to thank the donors who made the shared resources possible. These include the European Union, Germany, Sweden, and the United States of America. I hope that you who attended this meeting are taking inspiration and encouragement from this event. We need to understand what is happening, and this has been repeated by all speakers. Then we can speak up and challenge the status quo to become better in a gender-responsive approach to human trafficking and migrant smuggling. We hope you can join us again tomorrow when we discuss access to justice and protection for smuggled migrants, also as one of our events at the Knowledge Week. Thank you very much and have a lovely day wherever you are in the world. Thank you.